The silence in a boardroom is never empty. It is loaded, waiting for someone to pull the trigger. Give 23 years to an empire, and you smell betrayal before the termination papers slide across the mahogany. They thought I was a tired 45-year-old relic, easily swept away for their upcoming merger. They demanded my quiet exit, but they forgot one crucial detail. The architect of a foundation always knows exactly which brick to pull to collapse the entire building. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. We are so incredibly grateful for your continued support and love for our content. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without the operating budget to continue, which means we must pause our uploads here for the foreseeable future and shift our operations entirely to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community, where you can listen to even better, longer, and more detailed, exclusive true stories that we cannot make public on YouTube, fully produced with multiple emotional voice actors bringing the scenes to life. You can join us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. And now, let us dive into today's story, told from the perspective of our main character, Peyton Foster. The frosted glass walls of Conference Room B always felt like an interrogation chamber, especially at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. The ambient temperature was intentionally set, just low enough to make a person physically uncomfortable, a subtle psychological tactic designed to rush negotiations and force quick concessions. I am Peyton Foster, 45 years old, and until this exact moment, I was the director of data operations at Ethelgard Logistics, a massive supply chain software giant anchoring the gray, overcast Chicago skyline. When my calendar had pinged an hour earlier with an unexpected meeting invite from executive leadership, the corporate instincts I had meticulously honed over 2 decades flared immediately. No one schedules a mandatory sit-down at 4 o'clock on a Friday unless they intend to ruin your weekend or your life. I walked into the room. The air was sterile, smelling faintly of expensive cologne, ozone from the air purifier, and the sharp tang of whiteboard markers. Sitting across the polished, unnecessarily large mahogany table were 2 people who represented everything I despised about the modern corporate machine. Marcus Vance, a man who had occupied the chief executive officer chair for merely 8 months, sat with his hands steepled in front of his face. Next to him was Chloe Mercer, the director of human resources. Her lips were stretched into a perfectly symmetrical, extensively trained smile that did an absolutely abysmal job of masking her inherent, bureaucratic cruelty. "Peyton, please, take a seat," Marcus said. His voice carried the smooth, practiced cadence of a man who sold empty promises and vaporware to venture capitalists for a living. I sat down slowly, keeping my posture perfectly straight, placing my hands flat on the table, feeling the chilling bite of the wood against my palms. Chloe leaned forward, her eyes entirely devoid of warmth, like 2 flat stones in a frozen river. "Peyton, as you know, Ethelgard is entering a massive, highly anticipated transitional phase. We are looking at a strategic restructuring across all of our senior departments to ensure we are aligned with the new board directives." Marcus picked up the narrative seamlessly, not missing a single beat in their rehearsed choreography. "We are pivoting toward a highly aggressive new technology vision. Unfortunately, as we assess the leadership required to shepherd us through this upcoming acquisition, we feel that your current skill set is heavily rooted in our legacy systems. You represent an older era of this company. We want to give you the opportunity to step down voluntarily. We believe it is the best way for you to preserve your dignity, keep your professional face, and protect your legacy here." Chloe slid a heavy manila folder across the pristine table. It whispered against the wood and stopped precisely 1 inch from my fingertips. "Inside, you will find a generous severance package, along with a standard non-disclosure agreement," she said, her voice dripping with a sickeningly artificial empathy. "It includes 6 weeks of base pay to help you transition. In exchange, the agreement stipulates a 5-year non-compete clause in the entire logistics software industry and the immediate forfeiture of all your unvested bonus shares." I stared down at the unassuming beige folder. 6 weeks of pay for 23 years of my blood, sweat, and youth poured into this company. A 5-year ban from the very industry I helped pioneer. Total, absolute forfeiture of the equity I had painstakingly built from the ground up. I did not cry. My heart rate did not elevate. The sting of betrayal was instantly neutralized by an icy, crystal-clear wave of logic washing over my senses. I looked up from the table and locked my eyes directly onto Marcus's face. I watched the microscopic twitch in his left jaw muscle, the slight, involuntary dilation of his pupils. He was nervous. He was trying desperately to project ultimate corporate dominance. But beneath the tailored, $3,000 Italian suit, he was just a cornered animal trying to chew his way out of a trap. Then, the puzzle pieces snapped perfectly together in my mind. The upcoming merger audit. Over the past 8 months, Marcus had been recklessly and aggressively shifting funds, padding the revenue metrics, and hiding massive structural deficits to artificially inflate the company valuation for the pending $800 million acquisition. As the director of data operations, I was the supreme architect of the entire data warehouse. I was the one and only person in the entire organization who could clearly see the glaring discrepancies between his fabricated, glossy reports and the raw, unfiltered, unforgiving data. He did not care about my age. He did not care about my technological vision or legacy systems. He needed me out of the building before the external forensic auditors arrived next week. He was attempting to blindfold the only credible witness to his massive corporate fraud. I expected tears. He expected shouting, begging, or an emotional, humiliating breakdown from a tired, 45-year-old woman facing the abrupt, terrifying end of her long career. The silence in the room stretched out, thick, heavy, and suffocating. I placed my right hand on the manila folder. I did not open it. I did not even glance at the tab. I simply folded it neatly in half, creasing the thick paper down the middle, and tucked it firmly under my left arm. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Marcus, I said, my voice perfectly level, soft, and utterly devoid of any readable emotion. This is a highly significant transition for all of us. I will need a few days to thoroughly review these legal documents with my counsel and consult with my family before making any final, binding decisions. Chloe's heavily trained smile finally faltered, the corners of her mouth drooping by a fraction of a millimeter as panic flashed in her eyes. Peyton, wait. The severance offer is strictly contingent on an immediate signing. I will get back to you by Monday morning, I interrupted smoothly, standing up and pushing my heavy chair back in so it rested perfectly flush against the table edge. I smoothed the front of my blazer, gave the two of them a polite, chillingly detached nod, and turned around. I walked out the door without looking back. As the heavy glass door swung shut behind me, I caught a final, fleeting glimpse of Marcus through the frosted pane. His brow was deeply furrowed, his jaw clamped tightly shut in visible, seething frustration. He was furious that he had not achieved the immediate, crushing submission he had so carefully orchestrated. He truly thought he had just executed a flawless corporate assassination, cleanly removing his biggest obstacle. He had no idea that in his arrogant attempt to bury me, he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed for his own execution. I drove home in absolute silence. I did not turn on the radio, and I did not listen to any podcasts. When I unlocked the front door of my house, I did not collapse in the hallway. I did not shed a single tear of frustration or panic. Instead, I walked straight into the study, grabbed a heavy crystal glass from the antique oak cabinet, and poured myself a generous measure of aged Kentucky bourbon. The amber liquid burned pleasantly down my throat, providing a fiery, grounding contrast to the sterile, freezing air of the corporate suite I had just escaped. Glass in hand, I opened the door to the basement and slowly descended the wooden stairs into the darkness. The basement was cool, smelling faintly of dry earth and old pine wood. In the farthest corner, hidden behind towering stacks of holiday decorations and plastic bins filled with old winter coats, sat a heavy, fireproof metal lockbox. It was coated in a thick, undisturbed layer of gray dust. I set my drink down on a nearby workbench, wiped the grime away from the keypad with the sleeve of my blazer, and punched in the combination. The heavy steel latch disengaged with a solid, satisfying clack. Inside the box, resting securely beneath old tax returns and expired passports, was a single, yellowing document carefully enclosed in a protective plastic sleeve. Looking at the faded black ink on that paper, I was instantly pulled backward in time. 23 years ago, I was exactly 22 years old. The Ethelgard logistics empire was not a glittering skyscraper in downtown Chicago. It was a drafty, poorly insulated garage in a desolate, forgotten industrial park. We had wobbly folding tables instead of polished mahogany, and we survived on cheap instant coffee and cold delivery pizza instead of catered executive lunches. The original founders were brilliant visionaries, but completely inept at basic business management. They had a grand, sweeping idea for supply chain logistics, but they had absolutely no way to make the massive streams of data actually talk to each other. That was my job. I spent 90-hour weeks staring at a flickering monitor, my fingers flying frantically across a sticky keyboard, fueled entirely by youthful arrogance and pure, unadulterated passion. Over the course of one brutal, freezing winter, I single-handedly wrote the core routing algorithm. It was an intricate, beautiful piece of mathematics that allowed delivery fleets to optimize global routes in a fraction of a second. It was the absolute beating heart of the software. To this exact day, beneath all the glossy new user interfaces and modern web applications, my original code is still the fundamental engine running their entire multi-billion-dollar machine. But back in that freezing garage, we were completely broke. The founders sat me down on a sagging couch one evening and confessed that the initial seed money had officially dried up. They could not pay my salary for the next 6 months. They begged me to stay, offering me equity in a company that was merely days away from total bankruptcy. I refused the standard equity trap. Even at 22, I knew the exact, undeniable value of what I had created. So, I proposed an alternative solution. I took my raw code to a cheap patent attorney downtown. I formally registered the entire intellectual property of the core routing algorithm exclusively under my own personal name. Then, I drafted a licensing contract and brought it back to the founders. I agreed to lease the operational rights of my algorithm back to the company for exactly $1 per year. It was a massive lifeline for them, completely eliminating their payroll burden so they could keep the servers running. However, buried deep within the dense legalese of Appendix 4B, I inserted one very specific, entirely non-negotiable clause. The contract clearly stated that the company was granted a commercial license to utilize the algorithm if, and strictly if, Peyton Foster remained an active, full-time employee on the corporate payroll. The precise second my employment status was terminated, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, the licensing agreement would instantly and permanently evaporate. The company would immediately lose all legal rights to use, modify, or profit from the code. The founders signed it without a single second of hesitation, desperately thrilled just to keep the lights on for another week. Time passed. The company survived, thrived, and eventually exploded into a massive corporate entity. Over the spanning decades, there were endless rounds of venture capital funding, massive corporate expansions, and a revolving door of highly paid executives. The scrappy founders were bought out long ago, replaced by Wall Street suits who cared only about profit margins and quarterly projections. During every single financial audit, due diligence teams scoured our revenue streams and liability spreadsheets. Yet, somehow, the new guard was always so fiercely focused on the future that they never bothered to look back at the past. Not a single corporate lawyer ever dug deep enough into the archaic, foundational archives to read the original licensing agreements. The current elite simply assumed the company unconditionally owned everything it touched. They were completely blind to the fact that their entire magnificent empire was built on a piece of rented land. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the complex, smoky flavors settle on my tongue. I stared at my signature on the bottom of that old, fragile paper. A genuine smile crept across my face, breaking through the stoic, unbreakable mask I had worn all afternoon. Marcus Vance thought he was being a ruthless, visionary leader. He thought he was cleverly forcing an outdated 45-year-old woman out the door to clear the path for a massive $800 million acquisition. He wanted to trim the fat and make the books look absolutely pristine for the upcoming buyers. He had absolutely no idea that by trying to silently push me out, he had just firmly grasped the plug to his own company's life support machine, and he was about to rip it straight out of the wall. At exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning, I bypassed the standard employee entrance and walked directly into the executive elevator lobby. The building was humming with the usual frantic energy of a new work week, but my mind was a vault of absolute, undisturbed calm. Walking a half step behind me was Elias Thorne. Elias was my personal attorney, a man who possessed a remarkable economy of movement and words. He wore a charcoal gray suit that was immaculate but unassuming. His most striking feature was his eyes, which were pale, unblinking, and sharp enough to cut glass. He did not engage in small talk. He did not smile at receptionists. He existed purely to enforce the precise, lethal boundaries of the law. We took the elevator to the top floor and walked straight past the executive assistant, stepping unannounced into the sprawling, sunlit office of Marcus Vance. The space was an obscene display of modern corporate wealth, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. Marcus was sitting behind his massive glass desk, tapping aggressively on his phone. Chloe Mercer was perched on one of the expensive leather guest chairs, clutching her ubiquitous tablet. They both snapped their heads up as we entered, annoyance briefly flashing across their faces before being replaced by a poorly disguised look of triumphant relief. They assumed I had brought a lawyer to negotiate the pathetic severance package they had offered me on Friday. They were drastically mistaken. "Peyton," Marcus said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair and spreading his arms in a gesture of fake warmth. "And you brought counsel. Understandable, though largely unnecessary. We are perfectly willing to walk your lawyer through the severance terms so we can finalize this transition smoothly." I did not sit down. I did not return his greeting. I stepped forward and placed a single sheet of heavy, high-quality printer paper squarely in the center of his glass desk. There was no manila folder. There was no severance agreement. It was a letter I had meticulously drafted myself late Sunday night. "I am not here to negotiate the severance package, Marcus," I said, my voice projecting crisp, authoritative clarity across the large room. "I am here to deliver my response." Marcus frowned slightly, exchanging a quick, confused glance with Chloe before picking up the paper. The document was incredibly brief. It consisted of exactly 3 sentences. The first sentence formally acknowledged the leadership restructuring. The second sentence was the anchor. It read, "I accept immediate resignation, effective this exact hour, and concurrently trigger all legal consequences regarding intellectual property as strictly stipulated in Appendix 4B of my original employment agreement." The third sentence simply wished the company luck in its future endeavors. I watched Marcus's eyes scan the page. I tracked his pupils as they locked immediately onto the words, "immediate resignation." A subtle, highly satisfied smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. The psychological trap was functioning flawlessly. He was so utterly consumed by his desire to push me out the door and clear his path for the $800 million merger that his brain completely bypassed the second half of the paragraph. To a man like Marcus, a man whose entire career was built on superficial buzzwords and empty corporate posturing, my mention of an original employment agreement sounded like nothing more than the desperate, self-important legal jargon of a veteran employee trying to sound dignified on her way out. Chloe leaned over, reading the document upside down. She let out a small, quiet sigh of relief, clearly thrilled that she would not have to spend her morning arguing over non-compete clauses. They were entirely focused on the prize of my departure, completely blind to the tripwire I had just laid across their feet. Before Marcus could set the paper down, Elias stepped forward. The movement was smooth, but commanded immediate authority. He pulled a sleek, silver pen from his inside breast pocket and laid it next to the resignation letter. "Mr. Vance," Elias said. His voice was incredibly quiet, yet it carried a resonant, heavy weight, that instantly dominated the acoustics of the room. As acting legal counsel for Ms. Foster, I require your formal signature at the bottom of this document. This simply acknowledges that you, acting as the chief executive officer of this corporation, have received and accepted this resignation exactly as it is written in its entirety. Marcus scoffed, picking up the silver pen and twirling it between his fingers. He was clearly irritated by the formality, eager to get back to his merger negotiations. He did not want to waste another second on the past. "Of course," Marcus replied, his tone dripping with thick, patronizing arrogance. He hastily scribbled his signature across the bottom line, completely sealing his own fate without a single second of hesitation. He pushed this paper back toward Elias and leaned back, lacing his fingers together behind his head. He looked at me with a gaze full of mock pity. "You know, Peyton, taking the exit now is truly the best thing you could have done. You have made a very wise decision for your old age. The technology landscape is moving far too fast for legacy operators. Enjoy your retirement." I looked at his smug face. I did not flinch at his insult. Instead, a genuine, completely relaxed smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a chess player who had just watched their opponent gleefully move their king into a forced checkmate. "Thank you, Marcus," I replied softly. "I plan to." Elias smoothly retrieved the signed document, placed it into a slim leather portfolio, and stepped back. I offered my hand across the desk. Marcus shook it firmly, projecting the image of a magnanimous victor. I turned around and walked out of the executive suite with Elias matching my pace. I went down to the data operations floor for the very last time. I did not make a scene. I took a small, brown cardboard carton from the supply closet and quietly packed my personal belongings: a framed photograph of my dog, a vintage mechanical keyboard, and a customized coffee mug. I walked to the elevator banks, rode down to the ground floor, and crossed the massive marble lobby. As I pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors and stepped out onto the bustling Chicago sidewalk, I heard a sharp, electronic beep behind me. I turned my head just slightly. The security guard at the front desk was looking at his monitor, verifying that my corporate keycard had just been fully deactivated. My access to the building was officially severed. My employment was legally and permanently terminated. The trap had snapped completely shut. Exactly 48 hours after I walked out of those revolving doors, the invisible timer I had embedded in the system architecture finally hit zero. It was Wednesday morning, at precisely 9 o'clock. The main screens in the Network Operations Center of Ethelgard Logistics flickered, froze, and then violently shifted to a glaring, inescapable crimson red. The massive digital maps tracking tens of thousands of delivery trucks across the globe simultaneously halted, shipping manifests locked up, automated warehouse conveyor belts ground to a sudden, jarring halt. A singular, highly automated system prompt flashed across hundreds of monitors on multiple floors. The message was brutally concise. It read, "Algorithm copyright license expired. Cease commercial exploitation immediately." The network engineers scrambled in absolute terror, assuming it was a bizarre glitch, a rogue line of code, or a catastrophic cyber attack from a foreign entity. They hammered furiously at their keyboards, trying to bypass the lock screen, but the core routing engine was completely sealed behind an impenetrable wall of encrypted legal directives. The entire logistics grid of a multinational software giant was effectively paralyzed in the blink of an eye. 3 floors up, entirely oblivious to the technological meltdown happening in the basement, Julian Hayes was sitting in a soundproof, climate-controlled conference room. Julian was the head of legal for Ethelgard, a man whose entire career was built on aggressive litigation, finding loopholes, and burying smaller competitors in endless avalanches of paperwork. Currently, he was hosting the rigorous due diligence team from the massive conglomerate, attempting to finalize the $800 million acquisition. The acquiring lawyers were meticulously reviewing recent high-level personnel departures to ensure there were no lingering liabilities or wrongful termination suits waiting in the shadows. A junior analyst nervously handed Julian my resignation letter. the very same single sheet of paper Marcus had arrogantly and hastily signed on Monday morning. Julian scanned the 3 short sentences. His eyes caught instantly on the phrase, Appendix 4B. Unlike Marcus, Julian possessed a highly trained, paranoid legal mind that immediately recognized the terrifying gravity of a specifically referenced, codified contractual document, leaving the bewildered acquisition team behind with a stammered excuse. Julian practically sprinted to the secure corporate archives on the lowest level of the building. His hands were shaking violently as he bypassed the modern, digitized records and demanded the physical vault be opened by the bewildered security staff. He dug frantically through boxes of archaic paperwork until he pulled out the original employment contracts from 23 years ago. When Julian found the yellowing page containing Appendix 4B, all the blood completely drained from his face. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, staining the collar of his expensive bespoke shirt. He read the clause once. He read it a second time, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. The horrifying legal reality crashed down on him with the force of a runaway freight train. He realized that Ethelgard Logistics did not actually own the fundamental technology that powered their entire multi-billion-dollar enterprise. They had been merely renting it for $1 single a year. And because Marcus Vance had formally accepted my immediate resignation in writing, the company was now actively committing massive, unauthorized commercial exploitation of deeply guarded private intellectual property. The highly anticipated $800 million merger was no longer a historic financial victory for the board. It was a ticking time bomb that was about to detonate into a catastrophic, federal-scale copyright infringement lawsuit. Julian burst into the executive suite a few moments later, completely ignoring the protests of the administrative assistants. What followed inside that office was a display of frantic, unadulterated corporate terror. The realization that they were effectively running a pirated software empire sent shockwaves through the executive board. They had essentially sold a magnificent mansion without actually owning the land it was built upon. The only person on the entire planet who held the deed was the woman they had just smugly kicked to the curb to make their ledgers look prettier. Miles away from the suffocating panic of the financial district, I was sitting at my favorite corner table in a quiet, sunlit, independent coffee shop. The aroma of freshly roasted beans and warm pastries filled the air. My smartphone, sitting face up on the small wooden table, began to violently vibrate. It danced across the smooth surface, buzzing with a relentless, frantic energy. I simply watched the screen light up over and over again. There were 10 consecutive missed calls from the Human Resources Department. Following that came 5 separate, heavily flagged urgent emails from the legal department, all practically screaming for an immediate response. Then came the text messages directly from Marcus. I picked up the phone, unlocked the screen, and scrolled through his rapid descent into sheer panic. The first message arrived at 10 minutes past 9. It read, Peyton, there seems to be a technical glitch with your old access credentials. Call me back right now. 20 minutes later, the tone shifted drastically from a sharp command to a forced, trembling diplomacy. Peyton, Julian in legal, says there is a massive misunderstanding regarding your resignation paperwork. We need to talk immediately. By 10 o'clock, his inflated corporate arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by raw, unfiltered desperation. Please pick up the phone. Whatever you want. We can fix this. Just call me. I did not type a reply. I did not decline the incoming calls, allowing them to ring endlessly until they hit my automated voicemail. I locked the screen and placed the phone back onto the table. I picked up my porcelain cup, took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my perfectly brewed espresso, and opened the morning financial newspaper. The world of Ethelgard Logistics was currently engulfed in a raging, uncontrollable inferno of their own making. But in my little corner of the city, the silence was absolutely beautiful and utterly, magnificently destructive. By Thursday morning, the catastrophic silence of my departure had evolved into a desperate clamor for survival. I sat in the expansive mahogany-paneled conference room of Elias Thorne's private law firm, located 40 stories above the bustling city streets. The environment was the exact antithesis of Ethelgard's sterile, freezing glass boxes. Here, the air was warm, the leather chairs were deeply comfortable, and the atmosphere was saturated with undeniable, quiet power. Elias sat beside me, his hands resting perfectly still on the polished wooden table, waiting for the digital clock on the wall to strike 10. At precisely 10 o'clock, the large monitor mounted on the far wall flickered to life. We had agreed to a high-level video conference, a digital battleground where the final transfer of absolute power would take place. The gallery view populated with several video feeds, displaying the entire upper echelon of Ethelgard logistics. The contrast between Monday morning and today was staggeringly visible. In the center frame sat Marcus Vance, the impeccably tailored, $3,000 Italian suit he wore earlier in the week, now looked heavily rumpled, as if he had slept in it on his office couch. The supreme, arrogant posture was entirely gone, replaced by the hunched shoulders of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. Beside him sat Chloe Mercer. Her extensively trained, symmetrical corporate smile had vanished completely. Her face was a pale, drawn mask of sheer, unadulterated dread. On a separate feed, Julian Hayes, the head of legal, leaned dangerously close to his camera. His forehead was glistening with a thick layer of nervous sweat, his tie loosened, his collar unbuttoned. In the smaller, darker squares surrounding them were the silent, ominous figures of the executive board of directors, men and women whose immense personal wealth was currently evaporating by the second. Marcus cleared his throat. The sound echoed harshly through the high-definition speakers. "Peyton," he began, desperately attempting to inject a tone of calm, authoritative camaraderie into his trembling voice. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us today. I want to start by saying that we have all had a significant amount of time to review the events of the past few days. After consulting with the board, we firmly believe there has been a massive, unfortunate breakdown in internal communication. We are fundamentally a family here at Ethelgard, and sometimes, even close families experience severe misunderstandings during periods of high stress." I did not nod. I did not offer a polite smile. I simply stared directly into the camera lens, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch across the digital connection. I wanted him to feel the excruciating weight of his own pathetic lies. Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously before he continued. "We are entirely prepared to officially rescind your resignation document. We will wipe it completely from the corporate record, treating it as if it never existed. We eagerly want to welcome you back to your rightful position as Director of Data Operations. Furthermore, to demonstrate our deep commitment to your future with us, the board has authorized me to offer you a new compensation package. We will immediately increase your pay to 1.5 times your previous salary, retroactively applied to the beginning of this current fiscal year. All we require in return is for you to log into the administration portal today and restore the commercial operating license for the core routing architecture. We need to get the global fleets moving again by this afternoon." He looked at the camera with pleading eyes, hoping his financial bribe would trigger the submissive loyalty he assumed all long-term employees secretly harbored. He was still trying to play the game by his own fabricated rules. I leaned forward slowly, ensuring my face was perfectly framed and illuminated by the warm office lighting. I kept my voice incredibly soft, yet sharp enough to cut straight through the fiber optic cables. "Marcus, last Friday, you sat across from me in a freezing conference room and explicitly told me that my skill set was heavily rooted in legacy systems. You looked me in the eye and demanded that I step down voluntarily to preserve my professional dignity. I listened to your executive guidance. I did exactly what you advised. I walked away to save my face. Today, I am an independent corporate partner. I am no longer a subordinate you can intimidate, manipulate, or bribe with an inflated salary. And most importantly, my proprietary intellectual property is no longer available to rent for $1 a year." The rejection hit the room like a physical shockwave. Before Marcus could formulate a response, Julian Hayes violently pushed his chair forward. His face was flushed a dark, angry crimson. "You listen to me right now," Julian practically shouted into his microphone. spittle flying from his lips. What you are doing right now is highly illegal. You are maliciously holding critical, proprietary company property hostage. You are deliberately sabotaging an $800 million merger for personal vengeance. I swear to you, I will file a federal injunction before the hour is over. I will sue you for catastrophic corporate sabotage, massive breach of fiduciary duty, and extortive business practices. We have the capital to tie you up in aggressive litigation for the rest of your natural life. You will lose everything. Beside me, Elias Thorne shifted his weight. Then, he did something I had never witnessed in all our years of working together. Elias laughed. It was a dry, rasping, chilling sound that instantly paralyzed every single person on the opposing side of the screen. Without saying a word, Elias reached forward and clicked a single button on his control console. He shared his desktop screen directly into the video feed. Suddenly, the angry faces of the Ethelgard executives were replaced by a massive, high-resolution scan of my three-sentence resignation letter. "Mr. Hayes," Elias spoke, his voice completely devoid of emotion, striking like a gavel on solid wood. "As a fellow officer of the court, I highly suggest you revisit the foundational principles of contract law before you embarrass yourself by threatening my client with frivolous, baseless litigation. You cannot legally sue someone for stealing something that you voluntarily and officially threw away." Elias used his mouse to highlight the bottom of the document. My client formally offered her resignation, explicitly and clearly stating the immediate termination of Appendix 4B, your chief executive officer, acting with the full, unquestionable legal authority of your corporate board. Read those terms. He accepted those terms. He confidently signed his own name in ink to validate those terms. There is absolutely no hostage situation occurring here. You legally, willingly, and arrogantly surrendered your exclusive right to use the algorithm. You have zero grounds for a federal injunction. If you dare to file one, I will immediately countersue for malicious prosecution, and I will personally ensure the legal board strips you of your license to practice law. Julian slumped back in his chair as if he had been physically struck. The menacing legal attack dog had been completely muzzled in a matter of seconds. The board members in the background squares began whispering frantically into their microphones. The absolute transfer of power was now complete. I decided it was time to deliver the final, crushing blow. "There is one more crucial detail you should all be made aware of before we conclude this meeting," I said, capturing their terrified attention once more. "Yesterday afternoon, I received a highly interesting, confidential phone call. It seems your prospective buyers, the massive conglomerate you were so desperately trying to impress, conducted a highly thorough forensic investigation into why your entire global logistics network suddenly crashed." I paused, watching Marcus's eyes widen in sheer horror as he realized exactly where my words were leading. When their due diligence team traced the catastrophic legal failure back to my deactivated security credentials and the legally terminated copyright license, they did not call your executive suite. Marcus, they bypassed your company entirely. They called me directly. Chloe covered her mouth with both hands, stifling a loud gasp. They quickly realized that Ethelgard Logistics is currently nothing more than a hollow, useless shell. The only actual asset they wanted to acquire for $800 million was the proprietary routing algorithm itself. Since your leadership team voluntarily relinquished all commercial rights to that exact algorithm on Monday morning, they no longer have any logical, financial reason to acquire your company. They are currently drafting a direct exclusive purchase agreement to buy the core intellectual property straight from me. I leaned back in my comfortable leather chair, offering them a cold, finalized smile. They do not need you anymore, and neither do I. The digital silence in the video call was absolutely deafening. I watched the realization wash over the faces of the executive board members. They were staring down the barrel of total corporate annihilation. Without the core technology, their stock was virtually worthless, and their $800 million payday had just vanished into thin air. "However," I continued, my voice steady, cutting through the heavy tension, "the acquiring conglomerate is fundamentally a business of hardware and massive global reach. They want my software, but they would still strongly prefer to acquire an existing functioning logistics shell to house it. They are willing to proceed with purchasing Ethelgard, and I am willing to authorize a temporary bridge license to reactivate your servers right now. But that lifeline comes with two absolutely non-negotiable conditions. Marcus leaned forward, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. The board members leaned in as well. First, I said, locking my eyes directly onto the camera lens, Marcus Vance is to be terminated immediately, for cause. The board will cite gross negligence, willful destruction of corporate assets, and catastrophic mismanagement of fundamental intellectual property. Furthermore, his golden parachute is completely nullified. He will not receive a single cent of severance, no stock options, and absolutely no transitional consulting fees. He walks out of that building today with nothing but the suit on his back. Marcus erupted, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. You cannot do this. I am the chief executive officer. The board will never agree to this demand. I was violently cut off by the chairman of the board, an elderly man whose feed was located in the top right corner of the screen. Shut your mouth, Marcus, the chairman snapped, his voice trembling with unbridled fury. You have single-handedly jeopardized this entire corporation because you wanted to save a few pennies on a severance package to make your quarterly spreadsheet look better. You are finished. The chairman turned his digital gaze back to me. Ms. Foster, your first condition is accepted without a single moment of hesitation. Mr. Vance is formally removed from his position, effective this exact second. Security will escort him from the premises before this call concludes. What is your second condition? I glanced at the small square showing the HR director. Chloe Mercer is to be terminated alongside him. Her complete failure to execute basic due diligence during a senior termination process demonstrates a staggering level of professional incompetence. She is a massive liability to any future operations. Chloe let out a choked, terrified gasp, but no one on her side of the screen even looked at her. They were already calculating their own survival. Dumb, the chairman replied coldly. Consider them both gone. We will draft the termination papers immediately. Now, please, the servers. We are bleeding millions of dollars by the hour. I nodded to Elias. My lawyer reached over and pressed a sequence of keys on his laptop. Within 5 seconds, a confirmation email dinged on the chairman's computer. The temporary bridge license was active. Ethelgard's global fleet could move again, but only under the strict, watchful eye of my legal parameters. Over the next 3 days, Elias and I sat in that exact same warm, mahogany-paneled office, bypassing Ethelgard entirely to negotiate directly with the massive acquiring conglomerate. The final contract we drafted was a masterpiece of corporate victory. I sold the absolute permanent rights to my routing algorithm directly to the parent company for a lump sum of $45 million. But the money was not the most satisfying part of the document. I included an ironclad, legally binding clause that guaranteed every single one of my former data operations subordinates would retain their jobs, their seniority, and their full benefits through the entirety of the upcoming corporate transition. I made sure my people were protected from the exact corporate ruthlessness I had just destroyed. Marcus Vance, the man who had stood at the absolute pinnacle of corporate power, was cast out into the freezing Chicago wind with absolutely nothing. His reputation in the technology sector was completely, irreparably shattered. No venture capital firm would ever trust him with a single dollar again. He tried to bully an old relic out the door, and instead, he orchestrated his own spectacular demise. I signed my name on the final page of the $45 million acquisition contract. I closed the lid of my laptop. I stood up, shook Elias's hand, and walked out of the law firm. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors on the ground floor, I stepped out into the vibrant, beautiful afternoon sun. I took a deep breath of the crisp city air. I had not just reclaimed my dignity, I had forced the exact people who tried to trample it into the dirt to pay the ultimate, devastating price. Thank you so incredibly much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's journey of corporate justice satisfying, I kindly ask for your support. As a reminder, This channel is being completely demonetized by YouTube, meaning we will no longer upload new videos here for the foreseeable future. We are moving our entire operation to Patreon to survive. Please help us keep these amazing narratives alive by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. There, you will get access to our absolute best, highly detailed, exclusive true stories that are simply too intense to make public on this platform. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you again. Stay strong, and never let anyone underestimate your true value.